sticking with me. Oh, here we go. All right, thanks everyone for sticking with me. This session is on PAPs for experimental designs. Not much of what I'm going to say is specific to experiments. It's specific to ex-ante designs in general. So that is going to apply to survey designs, experimental designs. It's going to apply to observational research designs where you haven't collected the data yet, right? So anything where you haven't actually implemented that data strategy D is amenable to a pre-analysis plan. And it gives you this opportunity to call your shot. And so I think that that's going to be a theme of what the point of a pre-analysis plan is there is a boost to the credibility of work when you do what you said you were going to do. And so you can't be accused of post hoc trying to claim that you always meant to do that particular specification, right? So when there's a document online that says, here's what I mean to do, then later, if you do that thing, you can credibly say that you always meant to do it. And so this increases our certainty in the results only in the Bayesian framework. The Bayesian framework is something like, well, researchers have a choice over analytic strategies. And so I'm worried that they're picking their analytic strategies in order to sell a nicer story. But that's taken off the table if it's pre-registered. So in my discipline of political science, we are coming around slowly to pre-analysis plans, especially for experimental work. So one of our top 3 journals, the Journal of Politics, recently required any experiment to have been pre-registered. And they made basically no restrictions on what that means. So all of a sudden, which is a good thing, right? Because we're in the beginning of understanding what pre-registrations ought to look like. But this move by the JOP caused enormous concern because, first of all, you don't know beforehand whether you're going to get into the APSR or the AJPS or the JOP or some other journal that is not the top 3 journal. And so since it's a possibility that you're going to want to go to the JOP, this essentially means that every experimental study now needs to be pre-registered because there's some possibility that you're going to need to go to the JOP. You'd be so lucky, right? So pre-analysis plans for experiments are becoming 100% required in political science. They're required for other disciplines all the time because some of the kind of chicanery that they prevent are really important. So for example, medical trials, it's very bad if you get to analyze 100 outcomes and then report only the one that pops up statistically significant, right? So like my mother-in-law was trying to push on us a particular extract that she had heard about. We looked up the clinical trial and they tested hundreds of outcomes. And the only one that was significant was the one that ended up in the abstract, right? And so whatever, right? Like maybe it doesn't hurt. I could take the supplement that my mother-in-law wants me to, but we certainly don't learn from that study that indeed it has a positive effect on that thing. Okay, so pre-analysis plans are good for that sort of thing. They're not going to be a panacea, right? Because guess what? People pre-register very bad analyses all the time. And for crying out loud, it is good when a reviewer or others or the researchers themselves realize that what they thought they were going to do is not a good thing to have done, right? So pre-registrations, pre-analysis plans are not a contract. And that's going to be a theme of this as well, is that what do they really do? They establish what you thought at a particular moment in time. Writing down what you thought at a particular moment in time has this nice property that later you can say, if you do that thing that you always meant to, that's nice. But it also forces you to think about what your design is ex ante, right? And so that's going to be the real take-home message of this session is pre-analysis plans are for you, not them, right? They are to make it so that your design is better because it's an opportunity to engage in design declaration. All right, so with that throat clearing out of the way, I'll share screen. Okay, so we're going to use the MITA framework from the previous talk to talk about how to do pre-analysis plans. How does this fit in to our roadmap? Well, it's very clearly in pre-registration and pre-analysis plans, but it's also going to be a little tiny bit in this design planning part, because it's basically a freebie. If you write down your design well enough so that others can understand it, you can write it down well enough for you to understand it and to tweak it. So one of the things that's nice about a pre-analysis plan is when it shows, look at this design is really strong for inquiry 1, 2, 3, and 4. But for inquiries 5, 6, 7, and 8, those are just things that we're not super well designed for. So like, we're going to have less precise evidence on those things, as opposed to what inevitably happens when the paper gets written, where it's like, well, it's post hoc, we didn't actually have enough data to do that subgroup analysis, right? So if you plan to say, like, we're going to do that subgroup analysis, even though we know that it's low, right? So those are the sorts of things that you can say if you engage in design diagnosis at this stage. Okay. I think that there are 3 goals of pre-analysis plans. The first one is to establish and agree upon ex-ante intentions and expectations. All right, so establishing your ex-ante intentions, that means here's what I plan to do in order to generate the data. Here's what I plan to do in order to analyze the data. Here's what I think is going to happen, right? This gets all tangled up when people are writing their pre-analysis plans. They like write down their hypotheses, which are really often just their inquiries, right? Sometimes they say hypothesis 1A is the inquiry is positive. Hypothesis 1B, the inquiry is negative. No, much better just to say, what is your inquiry and what's your best guess about what its sign is, right? It's kind of silly the way that people are sort of rigidly following that hypothesis format. Okay, so you're going to establish your inquiries, you're going to establish your data and answer strategies, and you're going to say which way you think it is, and that's part of your model, right? My best guess model is that this inquiry is such and such, and that's how you can then start to say things like, this result is in line with expectations. Well, you have to have established expectations somewhere in order to say that they were in line with those expectations. So often papers begin by saying, oh, we found something surprising. It surprised us, which is to say it was not in line with expectations. Well, I need you to demonstrate that you really didn't think that, right? So establishing accident. So what is this parenthetical and agree upon? Experiments these days are usually not done by one researcher. They're usually done by a team of researchers, and they're usually done by a team of researchers in partnership with some other group, an NGO, a government, a business. And the pre-analysis plan is an opportunity to really establish what is going to happen at the end of this thing. So a nice example of this, I did an experiment with the Metropolitan Police Department in DC, randomly assigning some police officers to have a body-worn camera and some police officers to not have a body-worn camera. We did a pilot study in one district and then analyzed their results and presented a report exactly in the format that the final report was going to take, analyzing only one district and then saying, here's what's going to happen for the remainder of the districts. The one district was too small in order for the hypothesis to be confirmed or disconfirmed any which way, right? It's just too noisy. And then, okay, so literally there's going to be a dot on the graph which shows the effect of this thing on a particular kind of police behavior. And it was an opportunity for them to say, now, it's okay with us if you report that number positive, negative, or null. It's okay if you report that number positive, negative, or null, as opposed to ex post when the result comes back in a way that makes them look good or bad. Then having them be like, oh, no, I never thought you were going to do that, right? So you want to establish those ex ante expectations among the whole research group. Another thing that we used this for was to to share our pre-analysis plan among stakeholders. So we shared that pre-analysis plan among, like community activists and police groups and lawyers and all these sorts of groups that care about what body-worn cameras mean for policing, and say, okay, so what do you think is going to happen? So that we could then say, this result is novel or not novel. And the pre-analysis plan was a document that made it specific about what they were going to be responding to. Okay, so establishing and agreeing upon ex-ante intentions and expectations is a major purpose of this. The one that we often think about is that the pre-analysis plan is a constraining device, is that it's all of those researchers that are engaging in QRPs, questionable research practices, that we're going to stop them somehow from doing it by making them write down and stick to a plan. And so I have to say, I don't think that pre-analysis plans achieve this goal particularly well. I think what they do instead is that they, at best, point out which analyses are ex post and which analyses are ex ante, right? That's already a step in the right direction, but people are going to do their analyses. And that's just one of the, like, I have never, not one time, not one single time when I'm saying it here, recorded at BITSS, for crying out loud, I have never followed a pre-analysis plan exactly. I just always learn something between the time that I write the pre-analysis plan and when it happens, right? So the deviations are minor, I think, but they are nevertheless deviations from the path, and they are good deviations. I'm glad that I deviated. I'm glad that I made the analysis choices that were actually appropriate. I just didn't know that when I wrote it down. What is the major purpose of pre-analysis plans is to improve the designs, because you write them down. You're like, oh my goodness gracious, I have 18 hypotheses. That is too many for one paper. I don't mean all of these things. I need to do some theoretical work, right? So you improve designs, and usually what happens is designs get simpler when you write them down, right? So those are the three goals. Let's walk through them. All right, so establishing ex-ante intention expectations. As we've been talking about, it's more credible when something that you wrote down is pre-specified. And claims that results are surprising. It's only credible that it is surprising when I really believe that you thought the other thing before you did it. And we talked about this too. Sometimes team members and partners disagree about what we meant to do the whole time. And so PAPs are a really, really excellent place to work those things out beforehand. Yeah, I just really mean this highlighted point. Okay, it's really an important thing for the team itself. All right. So the second goal is to prevent ex post data analyses and reasoning. So what are them? Are they? So p-hacking. We use p-hacking as sort of like a blanket term for all of the bad practices. When I think of p-hacking, I think of that feeling. Perhaps you've had it too, when you're at the regression machine and you run y as a function of the treatment plus covariate 1 and covariate 2. Oh wait, actually covariate 1 times covariate 2. Oh wait, actually covariate 1 times covariate 2 plus covariate 3. Oh wait, actually. Oh wait, actually. And it's because you don't understand your data very well. You don't really understand what all of those variables, how they're intercorrelated. And so you start to convince yourself of one specification. And I have been there, literally at the keyboard, looking at p-values and realizing I am currently in a p-hack. I need to step away from the keyboard, right? And so I bet that you've had this feeling too. In fact, this is how regression is taught in lots and lots. And my first course on propensity score matching, the homework was try out 10 p-score models and tell us which one you think is best. It was literally go p-hack this data set and come back, right? So this is how it's taught in a lot of places because we don't know what the right model is, blah, blah, blah. That's p-hacking, and that's different from other kinds of bad things that we're trying to prevent. Harking, this is a really fun one. Hypothesizing after results are known. And that's why this thing has prevent ex post data analyses and reasoning. So harking is when you say your model after you know the answer AM, or after you know the empirical answer AD. Right, so after the results are known, you retrofit some theory in order to explain it. we as social scientists are excellent at explanation, right? So when the data speak, they usually speak in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves, right? And we are able to tell ourselves all kinds of stories. Some of them are even plausible, right? And so I have done this where I'm like, I don't know how to explain these results. Well, I guess it could be blah, 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 right? And you engage in harking, even if it's innocent, right? So you want to hypothesize before results are known. And that's one of the things that pre-analysis plans let you do. Outcome switching, that's what we were talking about with the medical trial, where you thought it was going to be on Y1, but it's actually on Y15 that something shows up. I think that this is possibly the most pernicious of these things, is when you have a lot of targets, especially in an experiment. If you have a lot of targets, it's not so much which control variables, because for crying out loud, the treatment is orthogonal to those covariates. So like they can only change things so much, right? Outcome switching is where things can really get crazy. If you've got lots and lots of opportunities for different outcome variables, you can really mislead yourself. And then the last thing that we're trying to prevent is unprincipled subgroup analysis. I don't know about you, but every single time I have submitted an experiment for review, one of the review requests is, did you consider subgroup analysis by X? Right? This is one of the ways in which we're curious. We're curious about treatment effect heterogeneity. And so reviewers, not knowing how to criticize anything else, or I don't know, maybe they're just satisfying their curiosity, will always propose subgroup analyses. And it's not just reviewers. At every talk, somebody says, but what about, is it different for, et cetera, right? And so we get led around to essentially doing a p-hack, no matter, this subgroup analysis, even if we don't intend to, because people are always asking, but what about, but what about, but what about? So the pre-analysis plan helps you decide beforehand, well, which of the subgroup analyses, according to the theory that I have beforehand, which and what theoretical question is being answered when we look at the heterogeneity according to a particular subgroup. Okay, so that's what a pre-analysis plan is trying to stop these things. But as that rant just kind of explained, it's just so hard. It's just putting your finger in a dam to try and stop people from doing these things. The purpose of the pre-analysis plan is to say, well, which ones of these things were thought of before and which ones of these things were thought of after? Because if you're a Bayesian and you're evaluating the work, you evaluate one class of analyses different from the other class. Okay, PAPs are not unbreakable contracts, and that's a good thing. Okay, people pre-register bad analyses all the time. I'm in a bit of a dispute with an editor who is saying that my critique of the author's analysis strategy can't go through because the author pre-registered a different one. I'm like, no, the fact that the author was wrong before the experiment doesn't change the fact that the author is wrong, right? So just because it's pre-registered doesn't mean it's sacrosanct, right? It's just what you meant beforehand. You can have meant a bad thing. So that's a problem. We also learn about better ways to analyze the data. This happens all the time. It's really common for people to use change scores, right? So they do a pre-analysis plan where they say, well, what I want to do is I want to measure the effect on post-treatment outcome, but I'm going to do the difference between the post-treatment outcome and the pre-treatment outcome. That's going to be my outcome variable, is the change score. Well, it turns out if you read chapter 4 of Gerber and Green, change scores, that's fine. You still get the estimate of the average treatment effect, but it's more variable than simply controlling in a regression for the pre-treatment score. And this is sort of like, there's like a cool regression reason why that's true. But change scores are less efficient than OLS. So if you didn't know that before, now you do know it. And if you need to change a pre-analysis plan, then you should, because that's like a more efficient estimator, right? So we learn about new and better analyses all the time. Finally, peer reviewers will make you do things, right? And it is not okay to say, well, the PAP says I can't do what you asked me to. All we can do is say, the peer reviewers made me do it. This is against the PAP. And so you can just communicate to your audiences, which ones were pre-specified and which ones were not. Okay, and the fact that they're not unbreakable has also unfortunate consequences, that people still fall prey to all of the ex post reasoning and all of the ex post analysis that they were going to do. And it's not really the job of the PAP to constrain them, right? Like it's not a legal contract. What it can do is it can give ammunition for the scientific community to understand, well, you can't represent that as something that you always meant to do because it's still not in your PAP.
Alex, a quick question here. What is a helpful way of thinking about analysis that were pre-specified versus the ex post analysis in a paper when we consume that research as readers?
Yeah. So one thing to say is that you hold it to a higher standard of evidence. So you're more skeptical of surprising findings, or you're more skeptical of those things that were arrived at ex post. So you can simulate this, right? So like, you've got 10 outcomes. What's the probability of landing on the good one, given the effect sizes that you believe? And so suppose that you obtain on outcome 7, if the effect size is just enormous, and like relative, and the T ratio is like 10 or something, you can believe that it's different from 0. You really can. And that one, if that's really true, it's not going to be the sort of thing that is only going to show up conditionally. Like sometimes it's not significant, sometimes it is significant, and so we're only going to see it when it happens to pop up. Like the null hypothesis is improbable that it's actually 0. Whereas when there are things that are just on the border, that you would never see that. It would never be reported if it were on the other side of significance, right? And so there's this screening, this conditional screening that happens. And so I think that I'm not sophisticated enough to know how much to downgrade evidence. I also don't really know what that means to what weight you have in your brain, but how much. But I do say if it's a squinter and it's an unpreregistered covariate by treatment interaction, I'm like, I just need a replication. And so that's something that I have asked for as a reviewer, like, oh, you did such interesting discovery, and it's okay to do discovery, because even though it wasn't in your PAP, it's just fine to do discovery. Why don't you now that you have discovered, why don't you go confirm, right? I feel like that's a reasonable standard to hold people to, even though it costs money, but science is hard. Okay. The main goal of the 3 is to improve designs. So the moment of writing a pre-analysis plan is usually the first time that we think about the design in its entirety. It's usually the first time that all the pieces have come together. The funding has come together, so you know what the feasible range of data strategies are. So you've worked through what the measurement procedure is going to be. You've written the survey instrument, or you have worked out with the administrative records how are you going to do it. You have sort of figured out what your expectations are. Maybe you've shopped it around. You've had to write the IRB application, which describes some design details. It doesn't IRB applications do not require a full design declaration. They require some little bits of it that along the way, when you're writing that thing, you learn about your design a little bit. So I want people to take the pre-analysis plan writing step as an opportunity to move from good idea to real design. And that means getting really specific. Get me okay, so how many units in each treatment condition? Literally, what is the randomization procedure that you're going to use? It just drives me nuts when people say I used random assignment. Okay, there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of procedures. They have very different properties. It makes a big difference how you did it. So I think that when you're writing a PAP, it's the moment to engage in design exploration. So let's talk now about the pre-analysis plan lifecycle. Sort of been alluding to this developing a pre-analysis plan part. So it is an iterative process. You try one out, you shop it around, you engage in design declaration and redesign, and you figure out which one is the good one. You argue with people. You have your partner say, no, that's not feasible. No, we don't want to commit to that analysis, etc. It's a lot of work. This part is hard. Once the hard part is done, then you do the easy part, which is to register. So I notice on the BITSS life cycle, or the roadmap, is that there's a distinction between pre-analysis plans and pre-registration. Right? So you can have a pre-analysis plan without telling anybody. That's just fine. You don't get this open science transparency benefit unless it's done in public. Right? And so that means putting it on the internet. It doesn't have to be ungated immediately. So a lot of people are worried about being scooped. They're worried about research subjects finding out about the hypothesis because they Google for it, and that kind of thing. So you can gate, and that's a reasonable perspective to take. You can't gate it for too long. Like, ungate it once the data are in, thank you. So I think that people maybe are a little bit more concerned about being scooped than they need to be, but it's possible. People do get scooped. And so you can gate things, and that's a reasonable thing to want to do. I've got ex ante here in quotation marks, because the moment of registration is a squirrely thing. Sometimes it's before any research activity is done. Yeah, right. Like, in order to do most experiments, you need to have done some bit of research activity. Maybe you have done a pilot study. Maybe you have worked out your measurement instrument. Maybe you have actually surveyed people baseline. Like, in order to do a block random assignment where you randomly assign people depending on some covariate values, you need to measure those covariate values, right? So there are points in the actual implementation that it's not like you like write down your MIDA and you start implementing your data strategy, and it might be after some of those implementations that you actually pre-register. It has also happened that people learn throughout the implementation phase that something's going to be a problem. Oh my goodness gracious, compliance is going to be crazy bad. We need to figure out our answer about what we're going to do about that before we get the outcome data in order to increase the credibility. So, like, you can pre-register an update to your PAP at any time up until the outcome data are merged with the treatment indicator. Now, that last point is, I had a PhD student here who, she did her experiment in Tanzania. It was an expensive experiment to go do. It was really hard. She hadn't actually done the pre-analysis plan beforehand. It was sort of on the fly. It was field work. It was hard to get the pre-analysis plan done, but she still wanted to engage in this kind of thinking. And so what she did is she gave the data set to someone else. They scrambled the outcome vector and then gave it, or maybe it was the treatment vector that was scrambled. The treatment vector was scrambled. And so it's not like that doesn't give her any information to like engage in post hoc analyses, but pretty much this was a way for her to actually write a pre-analysis plan using real figures and real tables. Here is the analysis that I'm going to do. It was all 0 because the treatment indicator had been shuffled. Then once she clicked submit on the thing, she could merge in the real treatment indicator and then see whether she was right or wrong, right? So that's like a really close of here's my shot and then actually taking the shot situation, which is one of the things that you can do. It's just about being transparent about when that happened. And so if there's fishiness about when it happened, so this is one of the problems in observational research. People are really worried. There's a senior methodologist in our field who was very upset about the possibility of observational studies being pre-registered, because what if you do the analysis on the publicly available data, you say you didn't, you pre-register the analysis that you did do, and then you get this extra boost of credibility for no good reason, right? So that's like getting the timing of these things solid is really a key part of this. So as long as you can demonstrate the timestamp before you had merged the treatment indicator and the outcome variables. Okay, you publicly register it. This is a new idea. There's a paper by Banerjee and colleagues in 2020 on populated PAPs, and I think it is great. So the idea here is that in econ especially, but in every discipline, the experiment is done, forever passes, and then the paper is published, right? It is so long between an experiment being done and like reviewers are finished and the typeset and it's set in stone and it has a journal identification number, right? Like that's a long time, and many, many, many things can happen in between. So just a populated PAP, what are the answers to the questions that you posed in the PAP? What are the answers to those questions? So that document, the populated PAP, doesn't do anything other than what was claimed to be done. There are no deviations, right? You just do the populated PAP. And that can be an appendix to your paper. It can be an online appendix. The internet has infinite space for that sort of thing. And I think it's a really nice way of being transparent. Here are the analyses as I thought they were going to be. Notice that they are different from the ones in the paper. And now I'm going to justify to you why they are different. But it's really easy to see, what if it doesn't make a difference, right? Like it often doesn't make a difference. And I'm sure that you've read papers where people will put a footnote, and we used logit and it didn't make a difference. And you're like, well, literally you got different numbers. So I would like to see what those numbers are, even if it doesn't make a difference in terms of star or something like that, right? So a populated PAP is a really nice way to just make good on the promises that the PAP laid out. I'm in the middle of writing a populated PAP right now for, well, it's an observational study in the sense that it's a meta-analysis of experiments. And man, did we ever pre-register more than I mean to write in the final paper, right? The populated PAP is just a blizzard of coefficients. It's a blizzard of regression tables. And this is never going to be in a published paper, I promise you. But it's going to be in one place where everything that we said we were going to do is transparently available. Okay, finally, and I was sort of hinting at this, so you want to do reconciliation. You need to explain, and I think that this deserves its own appendix section. Okay, how far from the PAP are you in the final paper? And this helps readers decide whether the deviations are good ones or whether they raise questions or what. And so the reconciliation section is a nice place to explain, the reason why we dropped the mediation analysis is because it's really biased. It exhibits post-treatment bias. We're not going to do mediation analysis. My mind got changed on this in between when I pre-registered it and after. We're not doing that because it's biased. And that's a good reason in the reconciliation section. Okay. Let's go through an example. Oh, wait, no, talk about what belongs in the PAP first. All right, so one thing that you may have encountered are templates for PAPs. And these templates are often a set of questions that you need to answer. How many subjects are there? Where's the sampling frame? What analysis? What are your hypotheses? What's the analysis frame? Etc. As predicted has I think it's got 10 questions. EGAP has a different set of 15 questions. This checklist is a development econ specific one. The BITSS resource library is just crazy. There's, I don't know, 20 different links of ways and places you could pre-register, right? These templates vary because different disciplines care about different things. And they want to pin you down specifically about the answer to that question. So in a consort diagram, it's okay, but literally how many were assessed to be eligible? How many were lost to follow-up? How many, and these specific questions that you really need to have written down in particular. A design declaration answers all of them because all of these questions are about the design in some way. And so if you write down your design in its fullness, you will be able to answer any of these template questions, right? So that's an argument for design declaration. Then you can fill out the templates. What do I think belongs in a pre-analysis plan? I don't care about the template questions because what if I had a design declaration? I have all of the answers I need. I want MIDA. What do I really, really want? Well, how much do I want A? Is I want to see mock analyses. I want to see one A sub D based on one imagined world. Just give me exactly what you're going to do on one draw of the simulated data. That means making figures and tables on the basis of fake data. This is a disciplining activity. It is time consuming. Wait a minute. I am going to have to write out, I have to make fake data that is going to support all of the analyses that I think I'm going to do one day. Good. You have to think about what each of those things means and what you think the answer to each of those things is. What else belongs in a pre-analysis plan? Well, if you've gone to all the trouble, then diagnose it and figure out, tell me what the power is, ex ante power. Because so many times people are like, well, you know, this null, you should think this is an important null because I was well powered. Well, what do you mean you were well powered? You had 90% power for a crazy treatment effect size? That doesn't mean that you're well powered, right? So I want to understand what you really thought beforehand. I want to understand whether it really was a strong design. And so you can explain that to me by diagnose it. And if you're diagnosing, this is if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk. If you're diagnosing, I'm going to want you to do redesign. It's totally possible that there is a better D and a better A out there. And so once you're at that point, then you could be like, all right, before we pre-register, let me just make sure I understand. So I learned a new thing just yesterday. I've always been skeptical of this idea that when you have a multi-arm trial, you should have a bigger control group. And they're like, it's always this heuristic argument. Oh, you've got lots of treatment groups, and so you're going to want to make sure that you're really good on the control group. I'm like, no, but for any one comparison, you're doing worse than you otherwise would. And so we simulated, and it turns out it is totally true that if you've got a multi-arm trial, a bigger control group is actually kind of useful. So this is something that we learned through design diagnosis and redesign. That's something that you can do at this moment of pre-analysis plans. All right, let's take this example. This is a paper by Bonilla and Tillery published in the APSR in 2020. Just to say, these authors are absolute models of research transparency. They have full code and data available on Dataverse. They pre-registered. They explain in their appendix what was pre-registered and what was not. I'm nevertheless going to say how I would have done it, which is different from how they did it. It's not to say that what they did is bad, but you know, they didn't do it in my way, right? And which is I'm trying to tell you about. So that's just to say I really applaud these authors. This is not intended as a criticism or a takedown in any way. All right, so this is a paper, which identity frames boost support for and mobilization in a Black Lives Matter movement and experimental test. So they're going to use a survey experiment to measure the effect of 3 frames, a Black nationalist frame, a feminist frame, and an LGBTQ rights frame on whether or not Black respondents support the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the question. So then the abstract says, we generate differential effects. So that differential effects thing is going to say, oh, they're doing subgroup analysis. They're doing subgroup analysis. And so what this pre-registration document is going to be, the question I have reading this abstract, the question I have when I look at the pre-analysis plan is, okay, so which of these subgroup analyses were pre-specified? Okay, so just to demonstrate how transparent they are, here's the data set on Dataverse. It's required by the APSR, but it's in the right spot. Here is their as predicted pre-registration document. And so you can see on as predicted, when you go to as predicted, there's a questionnaire that looks just like this. The first question is, have any data been collected for this study? So it establishes when you're starting. What's the main question, right? So it's a little bit hard to answer what's the main question. This is what is the inquiry? It's what this is about, but it's a vector of inquiries. And the words that are written here are written as will increase perceived effectiveness. Right, so that's like a claim about the sign of the inquiry. It's not super clear that it's the average treatment effect of this on that, but in any case, that's one of the problems with this template is that it's not super clear what this question, what the answers to this question mean. Describe the key dependent variable and how it will be measured. Okay, right, so that's part of what the main question is, just to critique the template. How many and which conditions will be, so that's great. We want to know that, but what we really want to know is what's the randomization protocol, right? Not just like how many conditions and what number of units are in each one. It's like, is it stratified random assignment? Is it complete random assignment? That's what we really want to know. Specify which analyses you will conduct. So this is sort of like, what's the data strategy? This is sort of like, what's the answer strategy? A little bit like that. And there are some details here. Let's go through how to declare this in declare design. So their model is about the sign of the treatment effects. We need to translate that into variables and constructs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine that there are some covariates. These are the covariates that they need. Your gender, sexuality, a measure of linked fate, which is how much Black respondents think that what happens to them happens to Black people in general matters for them. Their age, how religious they are, their income, whether they went to college or not, and how familiar they are with Black Lives Matters. We're also going to need to, there needs to be some unexplained variation in the outcome. And so we're going to generate that too here in the model. We're going to build a latent support for Black Lives Matters. And that's going to be a function of that unobserved variable plus correlations with these things. Now, where on earth did I come up with these correlations? That comes from theory. Honestly, that comes from theory. It has to come from theory. That's like where these expectations come from can also be expressed in the correlation of the covariates with the outcome. So maybe you use a previous survey. Maybe you use that fancy generate data procedure that I was describing earlier. Now we need to create potential outcomes. There needs to be as many potential outcomes as there are treatment conditions, right? Because it's under each treatment condition, what would each subject express as their support for Black Lives Matter? And so we're going to say, if you don't do anything, it's going to be your Black Lives Matter support. And I've got this Likert cut function, which translates something that is scaled into something that's got a 1 to 5 outcome space. This is important, right? All of the online power calculators are going to assume a normally distributed variable. The chunkiness of a Likert scale variable matters for power, matters for bias, matters for these things. So you want to simulate it like it's actually going to be. Those are the potential outcomes. Notice here that I've got differences depending on these variables. These are the hypothesized moderators of the treatment effect. So they think that the feminism treatment is going to work especially for women. They think that the intersectional treatment is going to work especially well for LGBTQ identifiers. So you want to build that into your model of potential outcomes. Okay, we will look at difference in responses between those who have pre-treatment familiarity, by gender, by affiliation, right? So we have some average treatment effects. This is the average treatment effect of the nationalism versus the baseline. The average treatment effect of the feminism treatment versus the baseline. The intersectional treatment versus the baseline. Those are the average effects. Now we have the difference in differences, the difference in effectiveness depending on the level of the other treatment. I did a cheeky little function here, this slope function, which lets you get that difference in difference coefficient regardless of whether the outcome variable is binary or whether it's continuous, because it's like covariance of a variance, that's like a regression coefficient. And it's a little trick so that all of them can have the same format. We think that this is overall treatment effect heterogeneity with respect to one covariate, familiarity, and then this is the treatment specific heterogeneity. So the nationalism treatment with respect to the linked fate, the feminism treatment with respect to whether you're a woman or not, the intersectional treatment with respect to whether you're LGBTQ. I should say all of this code has been posted to an R script. And if you have questions about it, Sophia is on call to answer your questions. Okay, data strategy. Now, that as predicted thing did not tell me how they were randomly assigning. I don't know, so I'm making it up. How am I going to make it up? Well, I know that they're using Qualtrics to do this. And I know that it is not possible to do anything other than simple random assignment on Qualtrics. You can do the like load balancing thing, but I don't think that they did that. I think they used Bernoulli random assignment. So it was like a coin flip weighted 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 for the 4 treatment conditions. This is important. Simple random assignment generates a wider sampling distribution than complete random assignment. And that's because you can have sometimes too many units or more than average units in one treatment condition versus the control condition, right? So complete random assignment would fix the margins and says there has to be this many in each one, and that would have a tighter sampling distribution. That's all to say that the quality of the research design depends on the specifics of the randomization procedure. And so here we're gonna have this simple RA1. Finally, we're gonna have a measurement procedure where the revealed level of BLM support is going to be this little spell here, reveal outcomes. There are 4 potential outcomes. The treatment gets realized and picks out the potential outcome that did happen for each unit, depending on which treatment assignment they're in. This little piece of infrastructure is here because it is hard in general to have a function. There's not like a general R function that says, using one column of data, pick out the value from 4 other columns of data to make another one. It's just like this switching equation is a complicated case win. And that's why we wrote a special function for that. Answer strategy. We will run an OLS regression predicting. Okay, so I think that this must mean that they're going to run outcome on treatment condition and then take out the coefficient on the treatment indicator, right? So it's not the predictions so much, it's the coefficient they're after. We will also look at differences in responses between those indicating. So I think what that means is that we're going to obtain the conditional average treatment effect for one group, the conditional average treatment effect for the other group, and take the difference. Right? So this look at differences language is all over the place. I'm going to look at this, I'm going to look at that. It's not specific. There's lots of ways to look at differences. We mean we're going to do an OLS with an interaction term and inspect the interaction term. Then finally, though we are not necessarily to have a strong effect because samples may lack adequate. So by strong effect, it's weird, right? I think what they mean here is we bet that this is going to be imprecise because we don't have enough data among LGBTQ identifiers, for example, right? There's not that many of them. So the interaction term is going to be estimated with a lot of noise. But that's different. The level of noise is different from the hypothesized strength of the effect, right? That's to say here, we don't want to say, I think that because it's a small sample size, the effect is going to be small. No, the effect is whatever you think it's going to be on the basis of theory, but it's going to be estimated with a little bit more in precision because the sample sizes are small. We plan to conduct analysis without controls. So they're going to do difference in means analysis, but as we will check for between group balance, we may also run OLS analyses. Now, I think that this is suggesting that if they find imbalance, then they will use covariate control. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do conditional control things. Like we would prefer to do all of these with covariate control because that's going to increase precision. But as written, the pre-analysis plan seems to be a conditional statement. We could build it into declare design. I'm not going to because writing those conditions out is really difficult. Like when it's when it's not balanced, then OLS. We're just going to do OLS and compare the results. All right. So the answer strategy has these 5 estimators. Look, it's just the outcome on treatment, but we need to grab specifically 3 coefficients and link them to 3 specific inquiries. It's this coefficient is linked to that inquiry. This coefficient is linked to that inquiry. This is annoying bookkeeping, but that's the important part. What coefficient is answering which question is an important piece of linking. That's linking AD to AM. Okay, now we want to know with controls. So we're going to control for age, gender, linked fate, LGBTQ status. And then we're still going to obtain these coefficients are going to be linked to those. Now we want to get the interaction terms according to familiarity. So these interaction terms correspond to these inquiries. Now we want to do it specifically for this linked fate one. This interaction term corresponds to this inquiry, and so on for these others. So you can see that like it's a little breezy in the as predicted thing. Here we are being super precise about which estimators are associated with which inquiries. You put it all together. So model, inquiry, data strategy, and strategy, that generates a design, and then you can draw data. This is like my favorite part of declarative design, honestly, is I write down this complicated design that I say, okay, please, can I have some data that looks like what it can be? And when I do it, draw data of design, and I get a data set that's got the structure that the eventual experiment is going to have. It's on the basis of that thing that I can make a fake regression table that looks like this. Okay, great, there's a fake regression table. I can put this directly in my pre-analysis plan to say, I'm gonna run these models in particular. I can make a mock figure that's going to explain exactly what it is. So these are the mock figures that I made on the basis of that mock data. The figure code is in that script. Okay. We've gone to all the trouble to diagnose it, or to declare it. Let's diagnose it. You can see that we should have not made this conditional. The power for the treatment effect is just always higher when we control. Right, so this one versus that one, this one versus that one. Right, it's always unbiased. We're doing great because it's a randomized experiment, so we don't have to worry about bias. But it shouldn't be a conditional estimator. OLS is not generating bias, but it's generating much higher power. Now let's look at the subgroup analyses. Right, all of these have power less than what we would want. Right? It's just like not big enough. It's not a big enough study to answer these questions well. Not a big enough study to answer these questions well. So if I were advising this research team at this moment, when they're just about to push go in their study, drop a treatment arm at least. Just pick one to not do, and then all of a sudden all of these numbers go up, right? Because you are spending, you're not going to have to spend 1/4 of the data on a treatment condition. And so it's like at this moment when you could simplify. You could also say like, wow, I'm doing better for gender. Why am I doing better for gender? Well, it's because like for crying out loud, it's half-half. I've got approximately equal numbers of units in both genders as measured. So that's going to be the one. So maybe we should be really focusing on this feminism treatment, right? Because the answers to these questions are imprecise. We're going to end up knowing approximately as much about these questions after the experiment as before. And that's what this table is kind of telling us. Okay, so after the study is realized, we're going to do this populated PAP. I already pitched this to you by saying, look, it takes forever to write the paper, so you gotta like just do the pre-analysis plan, do the analyses as you pre-registered. By the way, if you have written your PAP on the basis of mock data, then all it takes is to take the realized data, do one bit of munging to get the column names to be the same as you had it in the pre-analysis plan, and then you can just pour that data set into that script, and out come all of the analyses, biggity baggity boom. So here are the actual regression tables. Here's the actual figure. Okay, let's talk about reconciliation. You write the paper up, you present it in the department, you present it at the conference, you send it into the journal, you get referee reports. I just guarantee you that you're gonna have to change the analysis. This just happens every single time, which is part of the reason why we should not pretend like PAPs are some kind of prison, right? It's going to be different. So what we need to do now is to explain how it's different. We need to plan to do that. And that's a reconciliation section. So you can characterize the differences. Well, the inquiry changed. The inquiry changed because we encountered non-compliance. And so we went from the average treatment effect to complier average causal effect. That's going to require changes to M and changes to I. We also needed to measure compliance. So we have to change D. We also needed to now use two-stage least squares, which means there's a change to A. So every one of the little changes that happen can be characterized in this common language, in this common framework, and it helps readers to understand now what you're talking about when. What are we going to do in the case of Bonilla and Tillery? In their appendix, They say, we have been asked to consider other permanent moderators beyond gender and LGBTQ status, right? We have been asked is a nice way of saying the reviewers made us do it. So what you could do is you could make a table that looks like this one. What covariates are we doing heterogeneous effects by? In the pre-analysis plan, they said they were going to do this. It's not in the paper. They said they were going to do this. It's not in the paper, but gender and LGBTQ status is in the paper. Now you might think, well, the reason why I did that is because these ones were null. And of course they were null because there was no power to detect anything on the basis of the small number of observations, right? So they ended up sort of doing the design that they probably would have done had they done that. I don't know that for sure what they would have done, but you can see how it got simpler from the pre-analysis, from the pre-stage to the post-stage. And then in the appendix, the request of reviewers, well, you've got these variables mentioned or measured, so why not do heterogeneity by them too, which is what every reviewer loves to ask, right? So that's, you could then make a table like this, where it's super clear what came when, and you have now this reconciliation table is only about the heterogeneous effects analyses. It's not about estimators and other choices, but this section would include things like this. All right. I don't like it when three things. I don't like it when authors that I'm criticizing say, you can't make me, it's not in my PAP. I sure can make you, just say it wasn't in your PAP, right? This is an annoying thing of recalcitrance where people are pretending as though the PAP shields them from doing it right. No, it does not. You just can say, the reviewer made me do it. I'm also annoyed when I want to do something that wasn't in my PAP and then someone says, you're deviating. I'm like, yes, I am deviating. I learned something. I'm not pretending otherwise, right? You can still learn from this estimate, even though it wasn't pre-registered. You can just accord it less weight, or you can hold it to a higher standard, but you can't tell me I can't do it. I also don't like it when people say that, well, you know, nobody follows the PAP, so they're worthless. No, the whole point was that it's unseen advantage. The PAP helps you because you improve your design as a result of doing the PAP. So even if no one ever followed a PAP, they would still be worth something because it's an opportunity to learn about the design. Okay, so just to return to the top, goals of PAPs: establish and agree upon ex-ante intentions and expectations. This is super important. This is the whole Bayesian foundation of what a PAP does, is you need to know what, when you thought what. This is like Nixonian. What did the president know and when did he know it? We sort of want to constrain bad behavior. We're only sort of able to do that with PAPs. We're not even really sure that we want to increase our ability to do that because we want people able to deviate from them when it's appropriate. So then we're in the business of figuring out when is it a deviation appropriate and when is it not. And that's the situation we were in before pre-analysis plans came. When is this analysis appropriate and when is it not, right? So we still need to exercise judgment about that. And then to improve designs, that's the last thing. What am I asking you to do? I'm asking you to declare your design, and I don't care what software you use. I just want you to tell me what is an MIDNA. I want you to include real analysis of fake data in your PAP. That's the key thing. And then use this PAP as an opportunity to improve your design. So I'm going to leave it there and super happy to have any kind of discussion about this.